Steve Jobs, what was his secret to innovation? It was the auteur version of innovation, which you're not innovating by committee and trying to get everything into a product that everybody thinks they ought to be there. You're innovating on the basis of your own experience, and what you have a vision. And so the product becomes an edited product. It's edited to that vision you have, and superfluous stuff is not included. And so that's what we were doing. We were coming up with a boat that we wanted to own that didn't exist. And so we just kept following that.
Welcome to the In Factor. Today I'm privileged to host a true maverick, Robert Johnstone. Bob's journey isn't just a tale of sailing or business, but the story of an entrepreneurial spirit that's guided him across the seas and through the realms of innovation. From learning to sail at 2 years old to co-founding the internationally recognized J-Boats and MJM Yachts, he's always had an unyielding desire to chart new territories. These entrepreneurial waters recently led him to pen Maverick Marketer, a captivating memoir fusing together tales of sailing, love, and entrepreneurship. Through the lens of his entrepreneurial mindset, Bob shares how passion and persistence can lead to incredible breakthroughs. The lessons he's learned from building over 14,000 boats, earning 20-plus Boat of the Year awards, and being inducted into the National Sailing Hall of Fame are truly invaluable. Whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur, an avid sailor, or just someone who loves a good success story, Bob is here to inspire and encourage you to navigate your own entrepreneurial journey with confidence. Let's set sail into the conversation. So, Bob, thank you for joining me on the In Factor today.
You're welcome, Rebecca. Good to be here.
So this is just such an honor for me to have you on this podcast. I met you several years ago at a boat show, and your name is well known in the boating and the sailing industry. You're quite an inspiration with everything that you've done. And it's just, I don't know, it's just an honor for me as a boater and a sailor and as someone working in this industry to really, have time to talk to you today. So thank you for joining us. And I'm excited to share more about your story and your new book.
Well, you're most welcome. And it's nice to talk to someone else who's a boater.
Yeah. I think there are a lot more of us now after the pandemic, if sales are any evidence of that. So boating has done pretty well for a few years. Well, it's been a wonderful industry for a long time. So again, it's just great to have you today. And the In Factor, we talk about an entrepreneurial mindset, and your new book, Maverick Marketing, which I had the opportunity to read early on and loved, as you well know, is a wonderful book. Your background's in marketing, and I'm just curious as we get started, telling your story, how much of a maverick you are, because mavericks are defined as someone who's unorthodox or independent minded. And I think our audience would love to hear more about your story. So take us back to the beginning. How did you become the founder of 2 top boat companies, a book author, and one of the most recognized names in sailing? Were you from a boating family? I think you told me your hand was on a tiller at 2 years old. So how did this all happen, and how did you get to where you are now?
Well, I started out definitely as part of a boating family. My dad was on the Princeton sailing team in 1929 when intercollegiate sailing was just started. And what got me into my first race at 2 years old, when he was trying to push the program a little quickly for the family, I think. And anyway, that was the background for my startup in sailing, and I've always loved it as a sport. It's what I thought about all year long. I lived from one summer to the next, And I used to draw little pictures of sailboats in my first grade notebooks. And I actually put the J or an RJ in the sail. So that whole experience and was a big influence in my life. But as far as getting from there to actually creating a couple of boat companies, that's a pretty long story. You have to read the book.
Well, yeah, you've got to save some of it for the book, but you left the corporate world, right, to join your brother with J Boats, which is arguably the #1 worldwide performance boat in the world, and it has that little J on it. So, how did that all happen
The
for you?
boyhood dream became a reality. But from a standpoint of marketing or creating a business, it was a long process. I started out as a depression baby, and my parents were very much concerned with security. So when I graduated from college and got married and had the prospect of having to, bring up a family, my first reaction is I'd go to get a job at a big company. And I mean, that's just what you did. They would have the security. I wasn't about to start off on a company or a business of my own at that point. So it was a process which I think was accelerated by Quaker sending me to South America, at first as a production manager, and then as I became a general manager and CEO at a very young age of about 25 of this operating subsidiary in Colombia and then in Venezuela. And in trying to build those businesses, I realized pretty quickly that production, accounting, sales, those disciplines were far more readily acquired than what really built those businesses, which was marketing and product development. And I learned there, and I raised my hand to move out after 8 years to get back into headquarters in Chicago, because you can't live long enough to get good at marketing off on your own. Because if you come up with a new product, for instance, and take a year to develop it and so on, and then launch it in the market, it may take a total of 2, 3, 4 years before you find out whether it works or not. So I figured the only way that I was going to get good at marketing, which was critical to the growth of these companies, was to get back in Quaker headquarters, where they had 28 different business areas, and they were making errors right and left. And I figured, well, better learn by somebody else's errors than my own. And so that's how it started. And then I had the benefit of being able to work alongside one of Harvard Business School's best marketing professors, Walter Salmon, and Quaker had hired Walter to come and shape up its product management group. And at that point, I was in charge of dog food, believe it or not. And the president of Quaker was trying to raise the price of canned dog food to make the quarterly earnings look better. And I resisted it because at that point, canned kennel ration dog food was selling it a 6-pack for under $1. And I knew that if we raised the price, it would go over it. Supermarkets would knock off the special pricing, and our share of market would go down the tubes. So I fought that, and the president finally decided he didn't like my response. And so when he came up with this idea of getting Walter Salmon to shape up these product managers, I volunteered to be the guinea pig in the program. And that was a great experience. And it led to a couple of the features that I applied later in the boat business. One was um, the use of a brand name, to have an umbrella brand name that where that J in a bar would be on every sale, and then between the products, you just change the number for the length. And the beauty of that was, which we came up with the Canel brand and pet foods, was that when you advertise the latest and greatest new product, the magic of that excitement would rub off on all the other products with that brand that you'd previously created and introduced. So that was a revelation. That was one of the lessons I learned from that. But then I did well enough in the pet food business that the Quaker put me in charge of Willy Wonka candies. And they had the misguided notion that they didn't have to do any advertising because the movie was out there, and that would be sufficient in order to motivate kids and parents when they walk through supermarket aisles to buy these candies. And that was the second mistake. Candies aren't sold through supermarket aisles so much as they are in all these little mom and pop not grocery stores, but convenience stores and movie theaters and so on and so forth. So Quaker blew it there, as they did with Snapple later on, which also had that kind of distribution. And one of the lessons of this whole program is that you have to pay attention to how products are distributed and where they're distributed. And there were two other lessons I can describe later on about that. But anyway, so I was learning as I went along. And one of the things, well, no, I didn't really learn that much in terms of research with Quaker, but consumer research was certainly critical to testing any idea that you had. I think a classic example of that is after I left Quaker, I started up Naturescapes, which was a photographic wall murals of nature, big wall-sized murals. And I started out with the concept of black and white. And it was the purest version of the concept, which is like Alvin Toffler described in Future Shock, that as the world gets more complicated and difficult to understand, people want to relate to natural things, whether it's live plants or pets. And so the concept of Naturescapes was to have people project themselves into an image. And so my thought was, well, the black and white is the purest form of that, because they'll project themselves into that image and then start creating the temperature and the so on and so forth. And was I ever wrong? We invested our minor savings into 6 beautiful black and white images. And I remember the first time we showed them at a home show in Chicago, people would go by and say, "Ooh, too bad it isn't in color." And, so that we ended up having to take a second mortgage on our house and come up with one good color image of pines and birches in front of Walden Pond. And then that took off. But so if we'd done any research ahead of time, we probably could have figured that out. And the other lesson,
Yeah.
So
That, yeah, I was just going to say that those are some amazing lessons which you took from your previous work into your own businesses and then into the partnership with your brother. So how did you make the transition immediately from Quaker to your own business? I mean, how did that all happen? And then how did it happen that you decided to work with your brother? And J Boats, I think, is still a family business. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on in there, right?
A lot, yeah. All right. Well, let's see. I got away when I left Quaker. I felt I had a great job with Quaker. I ended up as director of market strategy and analysis, reporting to the president and his 6-man planning committee. So I would look at the plans for these different areas and make suggestions on how they could reduce the amount of capital and improve the probability of the profits they were forecasting. Long-range planning was just coming into the corporate world back in 1974, 1973. And computer calculation of market share and so on and so forth. I mean, it was, so I was in I guess, somewhat of the vanguard of that. And it was, so that was a great job. And in the debacle of the candy story, the president asked me, what did I want to do in the company, and I came up with this idea of a director of market strategy to do the fun stuff that he should be doing, which is figuring out what new products we should be coming out with, and what existing products we should milk. It's a Boston Consulting Group sort of matrix. You probably are familiar with that.
Yeah, sure.
Dogs and stars and so on and so forth. And anyway, so then in 1973, that oil crisis struck. And Quaker just went into the freeze mode. And it was, so my response was, what am I going to do? I'd take this plan that I'd come up with and dust it off next year and present it again. So I said, I think I've had it with a big corporation. And there's a great quote that's in the book from the, it was David Brooks, the psychiatrist, that I had ascended life's first mountain and found the view dissatisfying. And so I was about to climb the second mountain, which was to follow my own love of sailing in trying to create a business. And that's really where it was started, propelled by being hired as the VP marketing of AMF Alcourt, which made the Sunfish. And that brings up the second aspect of terms of strategy. And that was demographic trends. I was blessed by coming into the world 10 years before the baby boomers, this 70 million person bulge in the population. And in the sport of sailing, what happened in the late 60s and 70s was there were 100,000 or more boats being sold that were off the beach boats. Hobie cats, sunfish, snarks, lasers, and so on. The snarks, they were, I don't know if you remember that. You're probably too young for that, but I remember.
I know the lasers and the sunfish for sure.
Well,
that's how I learned. Yeah.
You could from a used carton of cool cigarettes, sent into the snark company, and $100 you got a sailboat.
Oh, cool.
And you can imagine how many of those are sold.
Except a lot of people were smoking cigarettes back then too, right?
Yeah, that's right. So that was a pretty effective program. So the problem with that is once they learned to sail on those fun, fast boats in bathing suits off the beach, usually single-handed, right?
Right.
That they'd want to involve their family, their girlfriends, their boyfriends, their kids, or whatever. And they wanted to spend more time on the water. And a sunfish was great in the Caribbean in a resort, or in summer in hot water, limited season. But the problem is 80% of the population of America is next to cold water, whether it's the West Coast or whether it's New England or, even Long Island Sound. In summer, you get hyperthermia sailing a sunfish in a bathing suit after an hour. So what was needed was a boat, a larger boat that they could sail in their street clothes that would also go fast. Because at that time, what was available were things like Catalina 22s and O'Day 25s and basically slugs, because the marketing people there, because they're small cruisers, were trying to get 8 bunks in a 22-footer sort of thing.
Yep.
When you do that, the boat doesn't go very
Right.
fast. So anyway, that's how that got started. And so that was the basis for the J24. I walked into AMF Alcourt with a 3-year plan and saying, we got to come up with a boat between 20 and 30 feet that was fast and that was that provided some basic accommodation, but not a lot, and that was fun to sail. That's how J-Boat started, and then it was a matter. Interesting enough, if you follow the demographic trends and what people of a certain age do, for powerboats, it was a 13-foot whaler. And then that became larger whalers and bigger boats and Grand Banks trail trawlers eventually. And we followed our size range and our owners group, if you will, up the same way, 30 feet, 36 feet, 44 feet, 48 feet, and so on. And then what happened afterwards was essentially we were just doing our thing. As it was pointed out that Steve Jobs, what was his secret of innovation? It was the auteur version of innovation, which you're not innovating by committee and trying to get everything into a product that everybody thinks they ought to be there. You're innovating on the basis of your own experience and what you have a vision. And so the product becomes an edited product. It's edited to that vision you have, and superfluous stuff is not included. And so that's what we were doing. We were coming up with a boat that we wanted to own that didn't exist. And so we just kept following that.
Yeah. It's really fascinating too, because if you think about then later, or in more recent years, your MJM Yachts, which is really named after your lovely wife, Mary, you were still following that trend, right? People got older. My husband and we sailed for many, many years, and then we reached a point where we went to the dark side and got a powerboat. So then, so MJM really was kind of would you say it was continuing to follow that demographic trend as a lot of those boaters decided maybe they wanted something that was a little different experience, more of a cruising rather than a high performance?
That's right. And we were using ourselves as the models of what people would want to do later, what all these baby boomers would do. I mean, we had, for our 40th wedding anniversary, I gave gave ourselves a Dyer 29 powerboat, which is a cute sort of down east type of boat. And we used that and alongside of our 40-foot racing sailboats, J120s. And next thing we knew, we were spending more time cruising on that little Dyer than we were on the sailboat. And we asked ourselves the question, what's going on here? We're getting older is what was going on, hauling up mainsails and folding them on the boom and being in foul gear all day long, and it was getting a little old as we got older. And so that's how the powerboat program started. And then I started applying the same train of thought that I had in developing and creating new sailboats with powerboats. Okay, what powerboat? If we're going to get a powerboat, what's it going to be? Well, let's see. The Hinkley's are pretty, but they're not very functional. And the functional lobster yachts are they're great, but they're slow. And so we wanted something that was functionally and pretty and functional at the same time. Knock 'em dead beauty, along with really versatile in terms of family use. And then we applied the same strategy, which I had mentioned earlier, that what got us into the J boats and also into the MJM was a strategy of best performing brand. Best performing brand. We learned when I was at Quaker as director of market strategy. They were interested in coming up with a line of recreational products. So I had to come up with a strategy. And in analyzing the market, there are three ways you can go. The cheapest product, which sells to just about anybody when the market's good and they don't know any better. And the middle range product, which are good products, but they're not very innovative or advanced technologically, and they change like the color of the cushions each year rather than, any major change. And then there was the best performing product. And the best performing product, I think I used as an example, Jean-Claude Killy holding up his skis after winning a downhill race at his Rosie's. And so people would go out and buy the higher priced Rosignol's because it would make them better. They thought that it would make them better skiers. And there was the higher, or let's say the best performing product is also more recession proof in the sense that the people who are dedicated to their sport, the aficionados, the last thing they're going to give up in bad economic times is probably their sport. So they'll hang in there longer. The products will hang in there longer. So
sure.
With that background, going back to the powerboats now, we looked out there and we just couldn't find, well, not only there, but there was no best performing brand. And it wasn't like sailboats. Sailboats, because you have finite energy source, the wind, you had to be very sophisticated in terms of your design and construction and so on. And that led us to boats like the J125 and the J145, which were carbon fiber hulls, that would be exceptionally fast. So when we looked at the powerboat market, we said, okay, how do you define performance in a powerboat? The way they've been doing it traditionally was the faster you went, the better performance it was, right? But you could put 6 outboards, 400 horsepower outboards on a barn door and go 50 miles an hour. That's not
right.
Very sophisticated design. It's just throwing money at a product. And that's what the market was doing. It still does. So we define performance on the basis of the amount of speed you could generate with X amount of horsepower. In other words, how much horsepower do you need to go 25 knots to stay ahead of following seas so that the seas aren't pushing you all around if you're slower than that. And so it was, that's how we ended up going in that direction. And that's how we went with a sailboat builder to start with, because there was no builder in powerboats, a production builder that was making a sophisticated high-tech boat. And so we had to start out using a sailboat guy who'd make America's Cup boats and Olympic winning sailboats to build a powerboat.
Yeah. I love that too, because as we were talking about it earlier, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you were following this wave of baby boomers and, baby boomers moving from wanting to race sailboat racing to wanting a higher performing, more comfortable, safer ride on a powerboat later in life. So so what a great lesson there, I think, for a lot of entrepreneurs to think about, because you learned a lot of these principles along the way with all of your different positions, and you found different ways to apply them depending on the stage and what was going on in the environment around you. And just a, I think a lot of great lessons there for an entrepreneur to think about as they think about pursuing their own entrepreneurial dreams.
Yeah, to understand the dynamics of the audience that you're addressing is really important.
Yeah.
And as people got older in boating, they had a choice to make. Um, so they may have had a boat that the husband and wife could both handle, the 45 footer or something like that. But then um, they got to the point where there are health issues, or um, what happens if one person gets injured? Am I going to get this boat back? And so on and so forth. So it was important to address that. And for instance, on a powerboat, um, well, I guess you take powerboats. You start out in sailing and you progress as a really dedicated boater into powerboats like you did and we did. So the next step is, okay, we have this 45-foot powerboat we might have gotten from our 40-foot sailboat or whatever. So what do we do next? What's the next step? Well, the next step is you either get a smaller boat you can tie up to your dock and do day boating with, or you get a much bigger boat and get a paid captain and crew to drive you around.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
So anyway, those are some of the dynamics, and that was one of the dynamics with MJM. That what are the baby boomers going to want? Well, they're going to want a pretty boat. By this time, they're probably back on shore from their worldwide cruising or long distance cruising,
Right.
and they have a lovely waterfront piece of property with a dock. So what's the boat that's going to look really great on the dock, but would still offer, some weekend cruises and so on and so forth. So that was essentially the fundamental.
Yeah, and it's a great boat. And of course, that's where I met you on an MJM, actually, checking it out. And
Yeah,
I love all this. It's so amazing to listen to your journey and not just see these beautiful boats that came out of it, but also the marketing mindset that went on behind it. And a part of it, you entitled your book Maverick Marketer, and being a maverick really means you're an independent thinker and you're kind of willing to do things a little bit differently. So very innovation focused, but very smart about it, because you definitely had a strategy. But there's always an element of risk in there. And you started out your conversation by saying, you were married and you needed to have an income. You had graduated from college, and so you took a corporate job. So I just have to ask you, do you think that being a sailor, you learned about risk early and you were able to apply some of that? Because with sailing, you just never know. Well, with boating, you never know. You don't know what the weather's going to be. You can't control that. You might have thought that you had everything under control, and then something happens, as we both know. And I see you smiling. So, but this is, to me, there are so many parallels there for entrepreneurship, from recognizing opportunities, when to sail, when not to sail, even more importantly sometimes. What kind of team do you want with you along the way, and then how do you perform under pressure, and how do you deal when things don't work out the way you want? Do you think that growing up sailing helped you deal with some of that along the way?
I definitely do, and it's hard to know to what extent, but the Harvard Business School, and you probably teach a decision tree exercise.
Yep.
Decision tree being you want to get from point A to point B, and step one, you have 3 or 4 different paths you could take. So you go with the one that has the highest probability of success. And then you go down that path and you take the next see the next branches and keep going down there until you get where you want to go. And 2 factors there. One, I think it was Jeff Bezos in his book of letters mentioned that a company to keep its dynamism and moving forward has to have fast decision making, and you're only going to know about 70% of all the stuff you'd like to know as you move forward. And that's true. That's again, it's like probabilities. And the same is true in sailboat racing. You have a bunch of boats around you. You have the wind to deal with. You have the tide to deal with. You have your own boat's performance to deal with, and the competitors, and you're making decisions, rapid decisions, constantly on the race course about which tack to take and should I go up, should I go down, and so on. And that's all. It's all essentially probabilities that you're assessing as you make all these little decisions. And one of the things that one of the conclusions I put, I think, in the preface was that possibly that exercise helped me later on in life, just as a general approach that to win the race, you just can't sit still until you have all the information you need. And some people call that the engineering mind. They want to be so precise, they have to have everything before they move forward. And whereas the sailboat racing mind is you've got to get across that finish line, and you just can't sit there until you figure out which way the wind's coming from.
That's right. That's right. And the other piece in all that, I think, is communication, which my husband and I learned a lot about each other when we started sailing together. And we had these headsets that we called the marriage savers. Because, I was often at the helm and he would be, barking orders, and that didn't go over so well. And especially when you're docking, you don't want to be screaming at each other. So the communication skills that I learned, because you have to be very specific and you often have to repeat back to other people what you've said or what they've said to you to ensure that you understand fully. And I think there's just so many amazing lessons for building and working with a team, and accomplishing a goal like winning the race, as you pointed out.
Well, what you bring up in communications is amazing. I mean, that is so important. And when you're sailing, what you're doing is you're also tapping into your subconscious to some extent. You've been here before. You can't quite articulate it at the time, but you're responding to some sort of prior situation in your back of your mind. And to have that be able to come out and apply to the current scene is really important. And there are 2 people I think I've sailed with in my life who really made me feel that I was really taking advantage of everything I knew and making decisions and running a boat. One of them was Bill Trinkle, who was Dennis Connor's right-hand man and tactician and trimmer. And the other was my grandson, Nick, who just had the ability to describe what was going on without telling me what to do. Most of the time when you put them in charge of being tactician, they say, go right, go left, do this, do that. And that just shuts down your whole head, But to be able to feed information to someone in a way that is, I don't know how to say it, non-demanding,
Non-threatening, maybe.
non-threatening, is an amazing skill.
It is. It is. And what a leadership skill. I think that's a great point. I really love that you brought that up because I think that there's just so many parallels there. And the other thing, your book the market Maverick Marketer draws on the concept of creative problem solving throughout, which I absolutely loved because I that's a topic that I teach to my students. This whole and if in a lot of surveys of leaders, that's what they're looking for, people that can be creative problem solvers. So I'm really curious about creative problem solving and sort of how that helped you build companies and achieve an amazing career, not only in business but in life. Can you share a story from your book or something about creative problem solving with our audience?
Oh my goodness, there are so many of them in there.
I know.
I mean,
You got to you got to get the book and read them, but I don't know if you've got a short one that maybe you would want to share.
well, there's a creative problem solving. The Well, one of them was the coming up with areparina, the instant arepa in Colombia, which is the bread of Colombia. They didn't start out with wheat bread. They started out with this corn, like a corn, not quite a tortilla, but it's a soft interior, nice crust on the outside by taking degerminated corn, cooking it overnight, and then turning it into a masa, and then putting it over a grill and flipping it back and forth. And that's what they were eating 3 meals a day, eating three times a day. And that's what Juan Valdez, that Colombian coffee guy used to be in the ads, used to have in his carriel, which looked like a purse. They have his arepas in there. And so Quaker tried to make that, Quaker being the largest corn products producer, grits and so on in the U.S., wanted to thought they could come up with an instant version of that because it took overnight to cook these arepas. And they after 7 years of research, they finally said, okay, here it is, go put it on the test market, put it in test market, which we did, and it was a disaster. It got hard on the outside and cracked and was all dry, and we had to pack it in this Benko seal cardboard tube, which is a paper poly aluminum foil of some kind that over the package, and it was really expensive, and it was a bust. So I said, there's got to be a way to figure this out. So I put on my khaki suit, typical gringo, and went up in the hills over Medellin in the poor barrios, and decided where Medellin had the reputation of making the best arepas or having the best arepas. So I went up into these poor barrios and was knocking on housewives' doors, and people were wondering, what is this gringo up to anyway? And this crowd started following me around, and they would ask me, what's going on? What do you think about Kennedy's Alianza para Progreso and so on and so forth? But anyway, the housewives described how they made them, and they ran them through this thing that looked like, remember the old meat grinders?
Mm-hmm.
They used to turn chunks of meat into hamburger sort of thing. Well, they had a device like that, except it wasn't forcing stuff through cracks or little holes. It was shearing the cooked corn like it just sort of separated it. And then they turned it into a patty like a hamburger, stick it on the grill, and would make this wonderful arepa. And I thought, then I had a flashback I think it was to my 8th grade biology class. And I said, I know what the problem is. The hammer mills we're using to break up the corn, the dry corn to turn into a masa, is rupturing the cell structure of the corn. And what they're doing is but with a shearing effect, is retaining the cell structure of the corn. It retained the water and the moisture when it was cooked. And so I went back and got some big industrial versions of this thing and started making them. And all of a sudden we were able to create a product that was even better than homemade.
Yeah, that's a great story. And what I hear when you talk about it is that you saw something you saw a failure, or at least an outcome that wasn't what you wanted. And so you decided to go learn more about it to see what you could learn. And then you started bringing together lots of information, even all the way back to your 8th grade classroom to bear to try to figure out how to solve it. So, it kind of leads me into this whole line of questioning around failure and challenges, because as I listen to you talk, I know you've dealt with a lot of outcomes that weren't what you wanted, what some people might think of as failures. And I think one thing that holds back a lot of entrepreneurs, and one that I see when I work with a lot of students, is they have a fear of failure. So I'm just curious about how you think about failure and maybe how you it sounds like you use this creative problem solving approach to help you deal with it. But I'm really curious about your mindset around failure and what kinds of thoughts you might have for the young people out there that are listening to this, and they see your success, but they're afraid of failure along the way.
Well, going back to the arepa, there's another, and this goes into several different groups where I had failures in distribution. For instance, how do you take one of the things we didn't do, and I didn't do initially in several instances, is I didn't follow the normal patterns of distribution. I thought I could outsmart the distribution system. Quaker did with that package. What we finally did, we looked at, okay, how can we overcome the price challenge there? So finally we got around to saying, okay, how is corn? What about the corn that they bought for these to make this, the raw corn, degerminated corn? How did that come when they made the homemade product? Well, it came in a 70-pound sack. And what would happen in the poor barrios, in the tiendas, in each of those markets, the single guy standing behind his tienda with all his beans and everything else out front, is he would take a 1-pound bag and he would scoop out of the big bag, put it in there, and put it up on the shelf behind him. The number of bags he thought he could sell during the day. So he'd have a whole bunch of brown bags with different stuff in them back there. So we said, well, okay, why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we have a big sack, and we had it full of pet feeds down there, so we had the technology of how to make these big sacks and pack them and stuff like that. Let's pack this product off in 70-pound bags, and we'll put in 72 branded white paper bags, white with a Quaker label on it and Areparina, and let them cheat a little bit, to 2 pounds worth. And when he put them up on the rack behind him, it would be the only branded white, beautiful bag, and everything else would be brown. And so that's what we did. And it was a huge success. In other words, it really brought the price down because we weren't putting in individual 1-pound bags. And we actually got a commendation from the World Health Organization when we applied that same strategy to Incaparina, which was the food that prevented kwashiorkor, infant deaths in Colombia. But so that was that. And then Same thing happened in Naturescapes, the photographic wall murals. I thought I could bypass the normal distribution of wall coverings and interior decorators and so on and so forth. And I took out a a 2-page ad in Chicago Magazine showing this beautiful image. And then said, all you have to do is send me $100 or send it to Naturescapes $100 and you get one of these things with all the instructions how to put it up. And I was so excited about it. I remember getting the biggest post office box in Wilmette. And then after the Chicago Magazine came out, I'm getting on my bicycle and driving down to the post office to check all the orders that were coming in. We didn't get one order for 2 weeks. And it just was a total bust. And I said, okay, Johnstone, you're going to have to double the price and go through wall covering outlets, paint and wallpaper stores, and interior designers. And we did that, and the business took off. And that was when Mary was running it. That's what financed the startup. She was our in-house venture capitalist. And that's what got J-Boats off the ground.
That's great. I love that. So you bootstrapped J-Boats.
And and the other thing was in sailing, the same thing was true. How are we going to put J24s on the map? Well, most of the performance boats at that time were sold by designer builders out the back door to their friends and so on. And they weren't professionally distributed they didn't want to give up any margin to any dealer. And I had learned in working with AMF Alcourt, which had about 150 dealers, that the way to sell lots of boats is through professional dealers throughout the country in the 80 or 100 sailing areas. So we started out with that strategy with the J24, and it worked. It was the first production boat, performance boat, that really had a decent dealer network. And so that was applying those lessons to products later on.
Yeah. It's one of the things that I often talk to my students about, the importance of being a learner. You're constantly learning as an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's all about learning. And it's in each one of these endeavors, and you've had a number of them in your life. And I'm sure, some amazingly successful and some maybe not as successful as you had hoped along the way. But in every one of them, you didn't have all the answers when you went in, I'm guessing. You had to learn it along the way. And I think that's what stops a lot of people, a lot of students. When I talk to them, they fear they don't know enough. And it sounds like to me that your advice is you got to get out there and try and learn, and that you'll be learning the whole way.
Well, there's another aspect of this.
Okay.
Which may be making it difficult for some of your students and concerned about taking risks, because even if you have a great idea, doesn't mean it's going to work. And so
that's right.
One of the most important things that I learned in the process of this was consumer research. If you've got a great idea, do other people share it with you?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's a good idea to find out before you put too much money behind it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other aspect of that is, are you coming up with a product that something somebody else did, or are you coming up like someone else did, or are you coming up with a product out of your own life experience? And I think back on some of the products I could have come up with if I pursued them, but never did. And it was just product ideas but I didn't. It was in an area that was not my area of expertise, and so I, went on and did other things. So like on the satellite, that chapter on satellite navigation, um, I was coming up with, because I'm looking for better ways to win races on boats, with instrumentation that would give me a better idea how fast I was going, how fast the current was going, and where I was. So it comes. The best products, I think, come out of one's own experience.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And sometimes the students and the young entrepreneurs that I work with probably need to gain some experience, and that experience can often guide what you want to do or what you should do,
Yeah, what you're going to be best at.
what you're going to be best at. Yeah, and you can. I think what you keep bringing up is you have to provide value to somebody else, and you have to understand them. So you have to have empathy for your market. You have to know them. You have to, and if you have experienced it yourself, it's a lot easier sometimes to understand than if you have to be, if you have to go out and explore it without that kind of background.
No question. No question. Yeah.
I'm curious about network and your experience as an entrepreneur, because networking is something that most entrepreneurs seem to need. They need other people along the way. Let me put it that way. There's they have to engage with other people. Have you always had a strategy about networking, or is it just part of who you are? Or how important, I guess, has building a network been to your success in all, in these various industries?
Well, there are two aspects of networking. One is um, your distribution system. If you don't have your own personal network, certainly a distribution system is going to get the word out to a bunch of people that you would never know. And not, for instance, on something like the naturescapes, photo wall murals. I didn't know a lot of people, dealing with photo wall murals or even use them. I wasn't in the interior decorator architectural digest world. So you have advertising that helps, but also a lot of products just aren't sold unless somebody recommended it. Even sailboats and motorboats. The primary reason why somebody will look at another or a product is a friend recommended it. Or I saw it on the water and I fell in love with it, sort of thing. So when you're starting out, that's pretty hard to get going because you got one boat and no friends. So
Right.
how do you take it from there? And that's where the dealers come in. The more people you can get talking about it and showing it and trying it. I remember some of the worst people to deal with in terms of getting new product ideas, which is strange, are dealers and distributors, because the only thing they want you to provide them with is something the other guy was selling really well last year, and I don't have it on my lineup of products, and that so they're looking backwards. They're not looking forward and imagining what people might want if it was available. And I remember starting out with the J24. I knew the dealers from having worked with AMF. I knew the other dealers other than the ones that were AMF Sunfish dealers, because I didn't want to have a conflict of interest after I left Alcourt. So I went after the dealers that weren't dealing with Sunfish. And they would say, Bob, that's a great boat. That's something I would really like, but it won't sell here. I said, what do you mean it won't sell? He said, well, it's just they don't buy boats like that. And I said, what you're saying is there's never been a boat like this here to buy, right?
That's right. That's right.
And it's hard for me to believe that if you think this is a great boat and you're a knowledgeable sailor, why wouldn't other people in the area think it's a good boat too? Just get one of these things, will you? And try it out and see what happens. Well, that's how we started, one at a time, going after these guys. So again, you're communicating one-on-one with somebody that can influence a bunch of other people. And there's your network, in one of your networks. Of course, today, with all the social media resources, there are ways to get out and get the word out much more efficiently than what we were dealing with back in the 1970s.
But it's still about building a community, though, isn't it? And about and I love that what you're saying, because it's really, as an entrepreneur, sometimes you're the only one initially that has that vision, and you've got to be able to communicate with others about the possibilities for it. And you got to not only provide value, but also be able to tell that story in a way that 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 others who can help you sell your product, in your case the dealers, could believe in it enough to carry the line.
Well, yeah, and it's I think the product development, or creating the product, innovating the product, that addresses that networking is important. For instance, when we came out with the J24, our biggest competitor was probably the CNC 24, which was distributed. I mean, it wasn't that fast a boat and so on, but they had pretty good sized classes, and CNC had a reputation of making a quality boat and so on. And they were building big fleets up in the Great Lakes, and they would come out with a new boat, new version, a Mark II or Mark III of the CNC 24 every year, which would pull the rug out from any one design development. So we started out with a very, very dedicated one design strategy, that we weren't going to change the boats in terms of their performance from one year to the next, because what that did is, where we'd started fleets of boats, or you had the top guy going out and getting a new boat and beating everybody because he had a new boat, and everybody had a bunch of dogs because they got last year's boat, that wasn't going to work. So we paid a lot of attention to that networking within clubs, and that communication, and that joint sort of enthusiasm that's created. Another one is also the versatility of the boat. The J24, most one design sailboats were harbor boats that you could sail in the harbor, like Lightnings and Shields and so on and so forth. But they're not boats that you take out in open water, particularly, because they weren't self-rescuing, or you could get in trouble and so on and so forth. They didn't have lifelines. And so by having a boat and didn't have bunks for family, little short weekend cruises and stuff. So by building into the boat those elements that would allow the boat to be used in different ways, did another thing. It also expanded your area of who you met with. For instance, if you went off in a J24 and tied up next to a 45-footer in some small harbor for the night, next thing you know, you're going back and forth in each other's boats. They're inviting you over for a drink and all this other stuff. So you develop a bunch of friends who are out cruising. And then if you have a one design race boat that also has fleets regionally, next thing you know, you're meeting people at these regattas like Block Island Race Week or whatever. And whereas if you just had a boat that's used only in a little harbor, you don't have that opportunity. So in effect, you're networking with a product strategy as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then,
That's great. Yeah, that's great advice. And I hadn't thought about it that way, but you actually built that into the design of the product so that it provided you even greater opportunity.
and then,
That's
then you become worldwide, and you have builders worldwide, licensees building boats to those specifications. Next thing you know, you're on airplanes running into people and pilots and so on that have one of these boats, and you're developing these friends all over the place.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then of course now, in today's terms, social media. Son Stewart is puts out a, I don't know if you've seen it, J News, every Friday, and it's about 30 pages, and it's an email newsletter, and he's got about 15,000 direct channels, and that goes out to all the dealers around the world, and each of those dealers has maybe 5,000 or 6,000 customers they've had over the years who get copies of this under the dealer newsletter. And then you have the social media multiplier beyond that. So he figures that there are probably 1 million people reading this newsletter every week. And what it's got in it is all the results from races all over, tons of great pictures, personal profiles, and stories. And I mean, it just creates a sense of belonging and I don't know, connection.
A community, actually,
Yeah,
I think.
community.
Yeah. 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 Like-minded people. And what a great marketing lesson in that. Well, Bob, I could talk on forever because I love this. So many great stories and so many good stories in your new book. It's a great book and I highly recommend it. In fact, I think everybody who wants to be an entrepreneur should be reading this book because there are so many great lessons in there. I mean, for anybody who wants to be in marketing as well, but since my audience and my community is mostly entrepreneurs and those who are entrepreneurially minded, it's a great book, and I'm just so glad that you decided to share these stories. I believe in stories. I think they're great ways to learn. And it's just, I don't know, it's been an honor for me to have this conversation with you and to share your story and our friendship here on the In Factor. And before I go, I just have one last question I have to ask you. It's a question I ask all my guests. And that is, knowing that our audience is those people who want to apply an entrepreneurial mindset in their work, whether they're working for a corporation or they're starting their own company or they want to start their own company, if you could only give them one piece of advice. Now, I know they have to buy the book because there's so much in there, but if it was only one piece of advice, what would that be?
Follow your heart. Do something that means a lot to you and that you're close to and have some knowledge of. And it's I think there are a lot of lessons in here. And then when you think you have the great idea, make sure you double check it with a little consumer research.
Make sure there's somebody else out there that thinks it's a good idea.
Before you try to do your business, make sure there's at least a few other people out there that think the same way.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I love following your heart. And you have certainly done that. And what a beautiful career you've had, and what great lessons. So thank you again for joining me today, and lots of love to you and Mary. And what a great experience. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You're welcome, Rebecca. It's been great fun. Great to talk with you.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about entrepreneurship, we would love it if you hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of In Factor.